So let me just start the today's session. Like today, we are going to learn one important concept called as a constructor. Okay. So moving forward, like only with the help of the constructor, like we are going to control the framework. Okay. So today, after teaching this constructor concept, I will be restructuring the framework. So I will be creating everything from the scratch, and let us try to like implement the concept of the constructor, because in a real time, so whenever you are working, so we are controlling the framework only with the help of the constructor. So before that, like we need to know like what is mean by constructor. So the constructor is nothing but, so we call them as an block of code similar to the method. Okay. So like a method, like we are going to create some block of code. So how we are going to create the block of code in the sense? So like as I told, we are going to create a method. So normally how we create a method? So we will be using the access modifier and we will be providing the method name. But here the rule is like, so you should provide the access modifier and the method name should be same that of the class name. So let's say if the class name is alpha, okay, so then if you need to create a constructor for this class, then you should use the access modifier and the constructor name should be same that of the class name. Okay, so this is the first rule. So or else like we can say this constructor as a special method. Okay, so basically the constructor is a special type of method and the constructor name should be same that of the class name. And what is the need of the constructor? So basically the constructor is used for, okay, so initializing the class variables. Okay, so whenever like we need to initialize the class variable, so we will be using the concept of the constructor. And one more point like we need to have in mind is like, so the constructor doesn't have any return type, which means will not return any value. Okay, but in yesterday's example, if you notice, like we have written some integer numerical values from a method, we have written a string value from the method. But whereas in case of a constructor, right, so we can't return anything. Okay, so basically we are going to create a constructor. So the constructor is should be same that of the class name. And second point is like, so it's a special method. And what is the purpose of the constructor is like, it is used for initializing the class variable and we are not having any return type. Okay, and when this constructor will be useful or when this constructor will be executed? So basically like, so constructor will execute so whenever we call that particular class. So whenever we trying to call that particular class, it always look for the constructor. If the constructor is available, it will execute the constructor first. If the constructor is not available, then what happen? By default at the back end, so it will create a default constructor. Okay, so it will check whether the constructor is present or not. If the constructor is present, it will execute the constructor. If the constructor is not present, okay, by default, so what happened? At the back end, it will create the default constructor, which means so whenever we are trying to run any of the class file at the back end, it is creating the like default constructor. Okay, so and how we are going to invoke the constructor? Okay, for example, rather than having the default constructor, I'm creating my own constructor, so which we call it as an, okay, parameterized constructor. Okay, so parameterized constructor in the sense, so when user creates the constructor, like we call it as an parameterized constructor. For example, like if I create the constructor, so then we call it as an parameterized constructor. So if the parameterized constructor is available, then it will execute the parameterized constructor. If the parameterized constructor is not available, then at the back end it will create the default constructor. Okay, and when we are going to execute this parameterized constructor, so generally, right, so whenever like we are creating an object, Okay, so during the time of object creation, the constructor call will happen. And how we create an object? So basically, right, we are creating the object with the help of the new keyword. Okay, so whenever like we create an object, or in other language, whenever like we call the class, okay, through other class, so then the constructor call will happen. Okay, so during that time, so this particular block will execute, the special method will execute. So what is the main use of the constructor is like to initialize the instance variable, so which is nothing but whatever the variables which is present in the respective class, so we are going to initialize those. Okay, so every time, so whenever like you are using the new keyword, so whenever you are creating an object, so whenever you are creating the new keyword, so during that time what happened, so the constructor call will happen. Okay, it will check whether the constructor is present. If the constructor is present, it will execute that respective constructor. If the constructor is not present, then it will execute the default constructor. Okay, so now let us create a some small problem for this, and pose that like I will just give you the practical implementation, so where we are going to use this respective concept, constructor concept. Okay, so now let me just create some separate class for the constructor. So let me just right click on the package, and let me just add a class name called as an constructor example. Okay, so just I'm adding the class called as an constructor example. Now the class will be created. So whenever like we need to execute that particular class, what we need to do? So we always create a main method. Okay, so I'm just having the main method. Now I'm going to create one global variable. Let the global variable be int a is equal to 1. Okay, so now as it is of a global variable, okay, we can access across any of the methods. So which means like even inside the main method, we can print the value of a. So now let me just try to add a sysout statement, and let me try to add the value called as an a. Okay, so now it is throwing the error. So the reason is like, so what is the method? It is a static method. So we have one rule. So the static method will accept only the static data. Okay, so I'm just making the method as an static. Okay, so now this is done. Now if I run the code, so now the value of a will be get printed. If I right click and if I just run this particular code, so what happened? So the output will be kind of an 1. So the reason is like because it is of a global variable, and we are able to access the global variable in any of the method. Okay, so now post execution, I'm just going to alter the code. So now if you see, so the output is 1. So as of now, we haven't created any of the constructor. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one constructor. So what is the rule of the constructor? So we should use the access modifier and pose that the constructor name should be same that of the class name. What is the class name? It's an constructor example. I'm just providing the name same that of the class name. So now this is the constructor. Now what I'm going to do, with the help of the constructor, I'm going to assign the value to this global variable. Okay, so I'm just having the variable as a, but I'm assigning the value called as an a is equal to 1. Okay, so now let me right click and let me try to run the program. Okay, so now if you notice, okay, so the output will be kind of an 0. Okay, so why it will be 0? So the reason is like, okay, so if you notice the output is 0, so the reason is like the constructor call doesn't happen. Okay, so when this constructor call happen, because for sure if the constructor call had happened, then it may assign the value to this global variable, and we may able to print that respective value. Okay, but here the constructor call doesn't happen. So I have told you one point. So when this constructor call will happen? Okay, so at the time of object creation, or we need to call that specific class. So we haven't created the object here, right? So it is not calling the constructor. So now what I'm trying to do, so for this particular class, I'm trying to create an object. So let's say, so constructor, okay, let the variable name be the C is equal to new of constructor. Okay, so now after adding the line, so initially if you notice it was 0 usage, but now it says 1 usage. So what happened in the sense, okay, so whenever like we are creating the object, so it will check for the constructor. If the constructor is present, it will execute the constructor. Okay, so now, okay, let me just add a breakpoint so that like you will understand much better. Okay, so I'm trying to, okay, run the code. Okay, and also like let me just try to keep a breakpoint in the sysout statement. So now if I run the code in debugger mode, so you could see, so the control will be initially jump into the constructor, because it always check for the constructor. If the constructor is present, it will execute that particular constructor. Okay, if the constructor is not present, so then at the back end it will be creating the default constructor. So now the constructor is present, so it has stepped into the constructor, and it has assigned the value called as an 1 to the variable called as an a. Okay, so now like if you resume the program, okay, so now the output of a will be 1. So the reason is like the constructor call has happened, and how we have made the constructor call in the sense, okay, with the help of an object creation. So we should always have in mind, so the constructor call will happen only during the object creation part, or else like we need to call the particular method. Okay, say sorry, particular class. Okay, if that is the case, the constructor call will happen. Okay, so now assume that like we are having two things. So probably what I'm going to do, rather than like assigning the value of a inside the constructor, I'm passing the value of a during the object creation. Okay, so let's say I'm just passing the value called as an 10. Okay, so now after passing the value called as an 10, it is throwing me the error, because whenever we create an object, so for sure the constructor call will happen. So in the object creation we are injecting the input. If we are injecting the input, so we should parameterize the constructor. And what kind of input we are injecting? So we are injecting the numerical input. So then I should parameterize the constructor. So let me just give the variable name as an a. Okay, so now what happened? Okay, so as a first step, like the constructor will execute, and while executing this constructor, like we are getting the input of a as 10. Okay, so now this int a is equal to 10 is going to act as a local variable for this constructor. Okay, because even though it is a constructor, it is kind of an special method, so which means like it is going to act as a local variable. But we are having one global variable called as an int a. So one and only if we assign the value to the global variable, so we can print it up. Now how we are going to assign the global variable, but the variable name is same. Okay, so whenever the variable name is same, and if you need to assign the value to the global variable, then we are going to use few keyword, like in which, so the first keyword which we are going to use today is called as an this. Okay, so the this keyword always refers to current instance of the class. Okay, so current instance of the class in the sense, so current instance variable of the class. Okay, so we can have in the main variable of the class. Okay, so when I say this keyword, so what happened? So it will, okay, consider the global variable, or else, like, for better understanding, let me create one more class and will explain this example, okay, and then we'll go back to the next step. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just creating the main method, okay. So now below the main method, I'm creating few other method. So let it be kind of an public void m1, okay, and I'm creating another method called as an public void, okay, m2. So now I'm having the global variable called as an int a is equal to 100, okay. Let me just type int a is equal to 100. So now if I try to print the value of a in any of the method, okay, so we can able to print it, okay. So just I'm adding this assert statement, I'm just adding the value of a. So now we need to run the program, but whenever we run the program, the main method will be execute first. So inside the main method, we need to call all other methods. So if we need to call all other methods, what we need to do, as it is of a non-static method, so we should always create the object for the particular class, okay. So if it is of a non-static, so we should always create an object. So now I'm just creating the object. Now this time, while creating the object, it will check for the constructor. So the constructor is not present, so by default at the backend it will executing the default constructor, okay. So now we have created the object. Now with the help of this object, I'm calling the m1 method and the m2 method, okay. So just I'm calling this m1 method and the m2 method. So now if I run the code, okay, so the output will be kind of an like 100 it will be printing two times because it will call the m1 method. So while calling the m1 method, so it will print the value of a. While calling the m2 method, it will print the value of a, okay. So the output will be kind of an 100. So now assume that here inside the m1 method, I'm having the local variable called as an int a is equal to 500, okay. I'm just giving the same variable name, okay, where the value is 500. So now this sysout statement, right, will it consider the local variable or the global variable? So for sure, the first preference will be always given to the local variable. If I right click and run this program, okay, so we will be getting the output as 500 and 100 because it will give the first preference to the local variable. So that's the reason it will print the output as an 500. Okay, so while executing this m1 method, so the output will be kind of an 500 because the preference will be given only to the local variable. But inside this m1 method, I need to, okay, use this global variable. Okay, so then this global variable is an like current instance of the class. Okay, so then how we are going to access this current instance of the class in the sense with the help of the this keyword. So if I add a sysout statement and if I print this dot a, so this dot a always refers to the current instance of the class, okay, current instance variable of the class, then it will consider the global variable. So now this dot a represents the global variable. If I run the program, so I will getting the output as 500, 100, and for this m2 method it will print the output called as an 100. Okay, so whenever we are using the this keyword, so this keyword refers to the current class instance variable. Okay, so now you could see the output, it is printing the 100. Now in similar way, assume that like we are having one more class. Okay, so let it be kind of an sample class. In this class, I'm having global variable int a is equal to 700. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to inherit the class. So with the help of the extends keyword, okay, I'm going to inherit that sample class. So whenever we do the inheritance, what happened, So the knowledge of this particular class will be injected over here. Now, in this class, we are having the global variable, and also in the sample class, we are having the global variable. So same variable name int a is equal to 100. So now, how we can access the global variable present in the extended class? So which we call it as a parent class. So how we can, okay, get access the global variable of the parent class in the sense with the help of the super keyword. Okay, so always this keyword represents the current instance of the class, whereas super keyword refers to the parent instance of the class. So now if I add a sysout statement called as an super dot a, okay, so whenever like we are using the keyword called as an super, and if it is inherited, then it will refers to the, okay, global variable which is present in the parent class. So now if I try to run this program, right, now I will be getting the output. Initially it will be 500, 100, 700 and the 100. Okay, so we are able to access the current class global variable, parent class global variable, as well as like we are able to access the local variable. Okay, so moving forward, like we will be using the keywords in multiple places. So especially this keyword we will be using in the multiple places. Now I'm going to use the same concept. Okay, so I'm just using the constructor example. Okay, now inside this constructor block, right, so we are passing the local variable. Okay, now we need to assign the knowledge of this local variable to this global variable A. And how we can pick this global variable? So obviously, like with the help of the keyword called as in this. So when I say this dot A, so it will refers to the, okay, current instance of the class, which is nothing but the current class instance variable. So to this current class instance variable, we are sharing the knowledge of the A. Okay, so now what happened? So the value called as in 10 will be passed to this particular constructor. So from this constructor, so the value will be assigned to the global variable, and whenever we access or wherever we access this global variable, the corresponding output will be get printed. Okay, now if I try to right click and run this program, right, so I may able to see the output. So now the value will be 10, and how we are passing or how we are assigning the value in the sense, so with the help of the constructor. Okay, so this is how the constructor will work. So again I'm repeating. So constructor is nothing but it's a just a block of code similar to the method, but when it will be called in the sense, so whenever there is the instance of the object is created. So instance of the object in the sense, like either we should call the particular class or else like we should create the object for the particular class. So whenever the instance is created, then it will check whether the constructor is present or not. If the constructor is not present, at the backend it will be creating the default constructor. Okay, or if the constructor is present, it will execute the parameterized constructor. Okay, so inside the parameterized constructor, so we are assigning the value to the class variables. Okay, and what is the need of the constructor is like to initialize the class variable. Okay, and another point I told is like, so while creating a constructor, the constructor name should be same that of the class name. So this is one point. And another point you need to have in the mind is like, so we don't have any explicit return type. So we won't return like the numerical values or string or any other thing. So normally the method will return, but this constructor won't return anything. Okay, so we don't have any return type. So now let's see the practical
Arvind,
implementation of this constructor. So
yes.
where this constructor is going to play the role.
Arvind, in the previous example, for the super keyword, you
Mhm.
told 700 is same. Can you explain how?
So basically, right, like whenever you use a super keyword, so now we have done the inheritance. So what is mean by inheritance? So inheritance means we are inheriting the knowledge of one class to other class. But if I just do the control click, so in case of an Windows, just do the control click. In case of an Mac, use the command click. So if I just click on it, it will be navigating to this particular class. And here we are having the global variable, which means even this global variable will be injected to this particular class, right? Because we have inherited, okay, you could see it says it's inherited. So when I just click on the inherited, so the knowledge, so now this example will have the knowledge of int a is equal to 100, int a is equal to 700. But if I need to use the value called as an int a is equal to 700 for my coding, then how I can access in the sense with the help of the super keyword. So whenever we use the super keyword, it will refers to the parent class. Okay, it will point to the global variable which is present in the parent class. It will access the parent class data. So that is the reason this particular line give me the output as 700. Whereas when we use this keyword, right, so it will refers to the current instance. So it will refers to the current instance of the class and the output will be 100. So when I say simply a, okay, it will check the local instance first. If the local instance is there, okay, then it will print the local instance. If the local instance is not there, then it will consider the global instance. But in our case, we are having the local instance as well as the global instance. So that is the reason to access the global instance we are using the this keyword. This is the global instance of the particular class. So whereas the super keyword is an global instance of the parent class.
Okay, so super keyword is acting from the different class.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I
now,
mean,
like, yeah,
one more question
yep.
regarding like generally when we are not returning anything, right? So
Hmm.
we give the keyword called void,
But this
but
is a special method, as per syntax. So we don't need to mention the void keyword because it don't have the return type. Because if you use the void, so then we can make the void to the return type, right? Because like whenever we are returning something, so we are changing the return type, right? So that's the
Mhm.
reason here we are not at all providing the void because it doesn't have the return statements.